this dance.
This video documentary is based on the Roaring '20s and the social development, Harlem Renaissance, and pop culture of the decade. American culture underwent rapid and radical change in the 1920s. Signs of this change were everywhere, in the music, the fashions of the day, in the habits and the pastimes of Americans, in the art and the literature of the country's most creative minds. Large population shifts and new technologies transformed the nation from rural to urban and from traditional to modern. After a decade-long struggle, women could finally vote. As a result, women were soon elected to state and local offices. In Wyoming, Nellie Taylor Ross became the nation's first woman governor when she won election in 1924 to complete the term of her husband, William B. Ross, who died in office. Miriam Ma Ferguson was elected governor of Texas the same year. It was a time for women to make changes, and changes they did. American women saw changes in their roles in the workforce. They filled a greater range of jobs than ever before. One popular image that reflects many of the changes affecting women in the 1920s was the flapper. The term refers to young women of the era who defied traditional ideas of proper dress and behavior. Flappers shocked society by chopping off their hair, raising their hemlines, wearing makeup, and going dancing in nightclubs, dancing to the famous dance, the Charleston. In general, the term flapper suggested a certain lifestyle of great independence and freedom. As the famous writer Dorothy Parker noted, "She's not what Grandma used to be." So while the flapper did represent some real shifts taking place in American society, the flapper craze took hold mainly in American cities. In many ways, the flapper phenomenon represented the growing divide between the nation's booming cities and the countryside. One segment of the economy, however, did not share in the good times. Farming took a hard hit in post-World War I. Hard times in agricultural contributed to a loss of a rural population, as people sought jobs in the cities. More Americans were living in urban areas than in rural areas. 3/4 of all workers worked somewhere other than a farm. The rise of the automobile also helped shift the geographic borderline between rural and urban America. As more rural people acquired cars, the distances that once separated them from the cities shrank. The shift from a mostly rural America to a mostly urban one was highly significant. Americans were living in larger communities. This population change also produced important shifts in values.
Every star above knows the one I love. Sweet Sue, it's you.
Urban and rural America differed significantly in the kind of values that were dominated in those places. In the minds of some people, rural America represented the traditional spirit of the nation: hardworking, self-reliant, religious, and independent. Cities, on the other hand, represented changes that threatened those values. The Ku Klux Klan grew dramatically in the 1920s. The new Klan drew many of its new members from rural America. Most of the new Klan members were workers, farmers, and small business owners. They saw their own status declining while the size and the cultural influence of urban America was increasing. Although founded in the South, the Klan had members nationwide in the 1920s, and at its peak, membership was in the millions. The uncertainty that comes with changing times caused many Americans to turn to religion for answers. One prominent key religious figure in the 1920s was that of a tough-talking former ball player named Billy Sunday.
So I didn't care. My soul is tired and weary. I hope to see her again up there. Let her go.
Sunday's beliefs were based on a literal interpretation of the Bible, which is called fundamentalism. Another leading fundamentalist preacher of the time was Amy Semple McPherson. McPherson presented a much more sophisticated image than Billy Sunday did. In fact, she seemed to embrace the kind of glamour that many other fundamentalists warned about. Her religion, however, was firmly in the fundamentalism tradition. As fundamentalism gained strength in the 1920s, it came into sharper conflict with the mode of teachings of modern science. A leading example of this conflict centered on the theories of the 19th century scientist Charles Darwin. The most controversial of Darwin's ideas is known as the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution holds that inherited characteristics of a population change over generations, and that as a result of these changes, new species sometimes arise. Fundamentalists worked very hard to keep this out of their public schools. In several states, there were laws passed to stop these teachings in the 1920s, and one such state was Tennessee. In 1925, the state of Tennessee made it a crime to teach evolution to its students. Opponents of the Tennessee law were quick to challenge this law. One such group persuaded a young science teacher named John Scopes to agree to violate the law and get himself arrested. This would set the stage for one of the most dramatic trials in our American history. Two distinguished, colorful lawyers who squared off against one another. Representing Scopes was Clarence Darrow, perhaps one of the most famous criminal lawyers in the country at that time, and William Jennings Bryan, the three-time candidate for president leading the prosecution. Bryan had become a major figure in the fundamentalist movement. He had influenced public opinion in Tennessee against evolution. The guilt of John Scopes was never really in doubt. In the trial, both sides focused on the larger issues. Bryan called it a contest between the competing ideas of Christianity and evolution. The defense openly stated that it was trying to make a point about freedom of speech. The key moment if I'm not able to explain it, I will accept it. The trial ended as expected with Scopes' conviction. He was fined $100. The Tennessee law remained in place until the 1960s. Prohibition was a nationwide constitutional ban on the sale, production, importation, and transportation of alcoholic beverages that remained in place from 1920 to to 1933. Prohibition was mandated under the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Prohibition began on January 17, 1920. Although it was highly people in the 1920s believed that prohibition would improve society, as generally did women, Southerners, those living in rural areas, and African Americans. While making, transporting, and selling alcohol was illegal, drinking it was not. Many people who continued to drink liquor during Prohibition and those who wanted alcohol had little trouble getting it. Prohibition gave rise to huge smuggling operations. Large amounts of alcohol slipped into the country through seaports and across the border of Canada. Newspaper headlines followed the high drama of the hunt for bootleggers, or liquor smugglers. Bootleggers came from the slang term for smuggling items inside the boot. These men were highly skilled at avoiding capture. In addition to smuggling liquor, many people simply made their own illegal alcohol using homemade equipment. Al Capone was one of the most influential gangsters during the Prohibition period. He used the alcohol trade to build businesses that earned tens of millions of dollars a year. Al Capone had a leading role in the illegal activities that lent Chicago its reputation as a lawless city. With his resources, Capone and other gangsters were able to frighten off and pay off the law enforcement agents who threatened them. Under the 1920s Prohibition, those with ties to organized crime commonly operated speakeasies. A speakeasy was a liquor establishment where alcoholic beverages were sold and consumed during Prohibition. To order alcohol without drawing attention or raising suspicion, bartenders asked customers to remain quiet and speak easy. Speakeasies were numerous. Some had food, floor shows, and live bands playing jazz. During the 1920s, Harlem was coming alive, and so was something called the jazz scene. This music blended several different musical forms from Lower South in a wholly original American form of music that was new, different, and exciting. Jazz could be heard in nightclubs, and while a jazz song might start with a melody or a theme, much of the music was improvised or composed on the spot. Jazz could be slow and easy to dance to, or it could be fast. In short, jazz was not defined by clear rules, but rather by its spirit and creativity. As the legendary great Louis Armstrong said, "Man, if you have to ask what it is, you'll never know." Louis Armstrong was a leading performer on the Harlem jazz scene, which was centered at clubs such as the Savoy Ballroom and the Cotton Club in New York City. The audiences were made up of large part of white jazz bands. They flocked Cab Calloway, composer the Duke Ellington, Fats Waller,
always follows the rest.
and the great blues singer Bessie Smith, and many more.
Troubles away.
The American people have always sought ways to entertain and inform themselves. In the 1920s, new media created whole new types of entertainment. One driving force was the development of the radio. During the 1920s, this device went from being a little-known novelty to being a standard equipment in the American home. Movies were another form of mass entertainment that exploded in popularity during the 1920s. There were many factors that explained this development. One was the change in the type of films available to viewers. In early years, most movies were short, simple pieces. One of the most important movie innovations of the 1920s was the introduction of the film to sound. In 1927, filmgoers watched in awe and amazement as actor Al Jolson appeared on screen, moved his lips to speak, and the words, "You ain't heard nothing yet," come from his mouth. That sentence was only one of the few spoken lines of dialogue in the film, The Jazz Singer, which opened at Warner's Theater in New York City. The movie included many songs and the traditional on-screen printed explanation of events, but the talkie had arrived. The Jazz Singer was a huge success and made millions of dollars for its producers. It helped change the movie industry forever.
Mammy, the sunshine beats, the sunshine wets, but I know where the sunshine's best. Mammy, Mammy, my heartstrings are tangled around. Well, Mammy, I'm a-coming. Sorry, I made you wait. I'm coming. I hope and trust I'm not late. Mammy, Mammy, I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles on my Mammy. Oh, Mammy, my little Mammy. The sunshine beats, the sunshine wets, but I know where the sunshine's best. It's on my Mammy I'm talking about, nobody else's. My little Mammy, my heartstrings are tangled around. Alabama, Mammy, I'm coming. I hope I didn't make you wait. Mammy, I'm coming. Oh, God, I hope I'm not late. Mammy, don't you know me? It's a little crazy. I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles on my Mammy.
From you, I'm gonna write words oh so sweet.
The movie star. The public responded with enthusiasm. One of the brightest stars of the 1920s was the silent film actor Charlie Chaplin. Millions loved his signature character, a tramp with ragged clothes and a derby hat. Another kind of hero emerged during the 1920s. These heroes allowed for new technology advances for Americans to travel overseas more quickly. On May 21st, 1917, a small single-engine airplane touched down on an airfield in Paris, France. In the cockpit was a lone pilot, Charles A. Lindbergh. 33 and 1/2 hours earlier, he had taken off from Muddy Airfield in New York on a non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. With his triumph, Lindbergh achieved what one newspaper called the greatest feat of a solitary man in the history of the human race.
Bidding farewell to his mother, Charles Lindbergh climbed aboard the Spirit of St. Louis, the plane he helped design. At 7:52 a.m., Lindbergh set off from Roosevelt Field on Long Island, New York. His goal to fly across the Atlantic. Lindbergh, dubbed the Lone Eagle, successfully piloted the first solo transatlantic flight, arriving in Paris in 33.5 hours. Returning to the States, Lindbergh received a hero's welcome and a Medal of Valor from New York Governor Al Smith. The journey of Charles Lindbergh carried him into the annals of aviation history.
Every star above knows the one I love.
A little over a year after Lindbergh's famous flight, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. She too returned to the United States as a hero. Earhart went on to a legendary career as a pilot. In 1937, she was most of the way to another record-breaking attempt to flight around the world when she disappeared over the Pacific Ocean.
Sweet Susie, 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 sweet Susie Q.
June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart jolted and bounced her fuel-laden Lockheed Electra into the bright Florida sky, setting out on the first leg of her daring attempt to fly around the world. In 1928, she became the first woman to fly the Atlantic as a passenger. 4 years later, determined to achieve distinction in her own right, she became the first woman to pilot herself across solo. That made her the first aviator of either sex to equal Lindbergh's daring feat. By the time she departed on her round-the-world effort, she'd become a friend of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and an inspiration to millions of American women. On July 2nd, 1937, 22,000 miles into the journey, Earhart took off from Blythe Beginning, heading for Howland Island, a mile-long dot in the Pacific. With Earhart overdue, the Coast Guard ship Itasca listened helplessly to her request for a fix on her position. She flew on, unable to hear their replies, running low on fuel. No trace of the plane or of its passengers has ever been found.
The American people's fascination with movie stars and heroes was matched in the 1920s by their devotion to sports heroes. We're going to read the following about some of the old-time favorites of sports during the 1920s. Baseball, considered the most popular sport during the 1920s, soon became known as America's pastime. Players and teams such as Babe Ruth and the New York Yankees were raised to pedestals of heroism. Less known, but just as important, were the talented players that included Satchel Paige, James Bell, and Josh Gibson, who contributed to the diversity of the game by starring in a newly created Negro League in 1920.
So my baby there stretched out on a long table.
Another popular sport during the 1920s was football. One of the heroes of the game was a man by the name of Harold Red Grange, who was also called the Galloping Ghost. He swept like a shadow across the college football field. He scored 5 consecutive touchdowns in a collegiate battle against Michigan. His decision to go pro sparked the establishment of football, the NFL, as a professional sport. He was also the first athlete to make the cover of Time magazine. The 1920s has been called the golden age of American sports. It also has been called the age of spectators. Sports heroes played because they loved it and because they were good at it. In the process, American athletes were the top performers among the most famous and wealthiest individuals in the world. As we have seen, the 1920s was a decade of great economic and social change. These times offered novelists a rich source of material. F. Scott Fitzgerald may be the writer most closely linked to the 1920s. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was a jazz-age novelist and a short story writer who is considered to be among the greatest 20th century American writers. The 1920s was the most influential decade of Scott's life. His works include short stories such as Bernice Bobs Her Hair, which helped to create the image of the flapper. Tales of the Jazz Age, his second short fiction collection, published in 1922, melded Fitzgerald's fascination with wealth with an awareness of a larger world, creating a subtle social critique. F. Scott Fitzgerald had immersed himself in the life and culture of his time. He lived the life, the Roaring Twenties, a time of prosperity, the Jazz Age, flappers, jazz music, and parties. And it was much of that real-life drama that he used to create his greatest novel, The Great Gatsby. The 1920s heralded a dramatic breakthrough between America's past and future. Before World War I, the country remained culturally rooted in the 19th century. But in the 1920s, America seemed to break its wistful attachment to the recent past and usher in a more modern era. The most vivid impressions of that era were flappers and dance halls, radio empires, automobiles, prohibition, speakeasies, the movies, novelists, and the jazz era. The country was confident and rich. But the 1920s were an age of extreme contradiction. The unmatched prosperity and cultural advancement was accomplished by intense social unrest and reaction. America stood at a crossroads between innovation and tradition. Many Americans were looking boldly ahead, but just as many were gazing backwards to cherish memories of a fabled national innocence. And I leave you with this.